Hey all, here OS Reviews. In our recent video, we discussed how there's been a bit of a resurgence in the popularity of point-and-shoot digital cameras. Even though these days smartphone cameras have gotten really powerful thanks to computational photography, a real camera can still be fun to shoot with, particularly with the tactility of physical controls, less distractions, and just having better ergonomics and grip if you are just shooting photos for hours and hours. And so to try and capitalize on this trend, interestingly, earlier this year, so very recently, Panasonic have actually refreshed one of their Superzoom or bridge style compact cameras called the ZS99. The only issue is if you're looking at the specs in terms of the sensor size, it's still a 1/2.3-inch size sensor, the same type found on digicams for years and years now. And by 2025 standards, this sensor is quite small, so it's not going to give you as much depth of field. Dynamic range might be more limited since it's able to collect less light information. And so more than anything, this is a re-release of some of their previous cameras, but just selling it again since many of those older models have been discontinued, because for a while the popularity of digicams were on their way out, but now we're seeing that reversal. So this is just kind of a rebranded version of that. And also one issue is maybe due to new tariffs as well as inflation, the cost of the ZS99 is quite expensive at $700, which is why in this video we're taking a revisited throwback look at one of the older models in the series, also known as the ZS50 or the TZ70, standing for Travel Zoom series. It's a line that Panasonic have been making since the early 2000s. For example, back in 2008, they released the TZ5, which at the time had a 10 times optical zoom, whereas on the TZ70 from 2015, so believe it or not, this camera is now over a decade old. It was then upgraded all the way to 30 times optical zoom, the same amount as well as general design that has been retained ever since on the ZS99 that was released earlier this year. So it's kind of wild that this model from 2015, over a decade ago, has been just slightly upgraded and now being sold once again, remaining nice and sharp throughout the entire zoom range continuously, compared to on smartphone cameras. Even though we're starting to see some telescopic zoom lenses, they tend to be only sharp at set focal lengths, like 3 times zoom, 5 times zoom, and if you're trying to go anywhere in between smoothly, then it will be cropping digitally and you'll see a loss in resolution. So a true continuous optical zoom system here can still have some advantages, remaining nice and sharp as you are, again, scrolling through the entire zoom range, and also relatively compact as well, so easy enough to travel with and put into a pocket, for example, taking with you pretty easily. So I guess in some ways it's not that surprising that the newest model is just an incremental upgrade over this 2015 version, just because this was already quite mature for its time, and if they wanted to increase the sensor size to something like maybe a 1-inch type, then the entire lens mechanism would have to be significantly larger as well if they wanted to retain the 30 times optical zoom, just because with the larger surface area of the sensor underneath, you would obviously need a larger piece of glass to cover up that entire sensor, and so the entire thing would become more bulky, which is why on Sony's RX100 series, for example, which has a similar dimension, only has around 3 to 4 times optical zoom. Whereas on this smaller sensor camera, it's able to get 10 times further reach. So aside from the sensor and lens remaining essentially unchanged after all these years, another reason to consider an older model like this would be, again, pricing, because you can often find these used on sites like eBay, for example, if you're shopping around, for around $200, if not less, making it just a third, if you're lucky, maybe a fourth, the price of the latest revision. And in terms of the photo quality, it's actually going to be almost identical, spoiler alert, because it's using the same glass as well as the same sensor. Now, the only upgrades of the newer model, though, would be support for 4K video recording compared to 1080p Full HD resolution on the previous model, but again, they're still using the same sensor inside, it's just been upscaled, and also the newer model having an articulating pop-up screen that can flip, compared to on this older ZS50, the screen did not articulate, so it was just flush on the back. However, similar to the latest revision, it also keeps the EVF or electronic viewfinder functionality, which is actually kind of rare on these smaller compact point-and-shoots. It's quite useful and even features a built-in proximity sensor. So if you put your eye to it as well as a diopter for adjusting focus, it can switch automatically into the viewfinder mode instead and turn off the main display. Perhaps if you are using it in brighter environments outdoors, the screen is washing out, then you'll be able to leverage that viewfinder instead and still see pretty clearly. Also, the ZS50 definitely feels like a very modern camera. I would argue that really any camera from 2015 onwards, packing in functionality like built-in Wi-Fi for wireless photo transfer, as well as an optional companion app that allows you to use it kind of like a security camera where you can use your phone to control the camera from afar. Not to mention an extremely fast and accurate autofocus detection system, as well as having a built-in accelerometer that can automatically straighten out your video footage. So if you're putting this onto a tripod that's a little bit skewed, for example, it will automatically shift the image to be perfectly level by itself. So these are all smarter features that definitely makes it feel like a more modern and fast camera compared to some of the digicams from the early 2000s. That being said, before we dive too deeply into the performance and a closer look at that design, I will just say again, this particular series, the Travel Zoom or the ZS, is all about the increased optical zoom reach, being able to get closer to faraway objects, compared to if you really wanted the best, again, photo quality, you would usually want a larger sensor compact camera like the aforementioned Sony RX100, or even some of Panasonic's own LX series cameras would be more of their enthusiast equivalents. In our other recent video, we looked at the LX3 that I think has held up extremely well, and this camera also has a slightly larger 1/1.6 inch sensor compared to the 1/2.3 inch, but again, you're not getting as much zoom or reach as the crazy 30 times packed into this really slim ZS series camera. So just keep that in mind. One is for getting you closer, however, it sacrifices maybe just a little bit in terms of the photo quality actually not being all that dramatically different from what you can achieve on a modern smartphone. In fact, even modern phones these days, many of the flagship devices are already incorporating larger sensors increasingly. So this produces good enough casual results, primarily for the extended reach of that 30 times zoom in a small body, compared to models which are all about the image quality but has less zoom or reach, so serving slightly different purposes. Coming back to the build and design, it also isn't quite as premium feeling as on their flagship or enthusiast grade cameras, but I would say it's around 50% metal and 50% plastic in terms of the build, which remains true on their newer revisions of this line as well. So for example, the front faceplate here is made out of metal, including a pretty cool lens ring, which I think is one of the aspects that I do like about these newer revisions of this Travel Zoom series. It's actually extremely smooth and satisfying to use, giving you more precise control over properties like manual focus and zoom, assigning it different functions, which is actually quite nice. And despite the average sensor size and photo quality, it does allow you to shoot in RAW like most modern cameras, meaning that you are able to edit the photos, recover more details in software like Photoshop. So a pretty solid feature set. That being said, if you're looking at the very top of the camera, it then transitions into plastic. So this plate here is plastic, including all the dials as well as the buttons for the shutter key, including the power key is plastic, which is why you can see the paint maybe falling off a little bit here after a decade of repeated use. Metal buttons on their LX series just feels maybe a little bit more robust, although part of that is also due to inflation, because when the Travel Zoom series first came out a decade prior to this model, actually the top, including all the keys and buttons, were all made out of metal, but by the time we got into the mid-2010s, again, they had transitioned into more plastic materials. But maybe part of this is for better antenna reception for Wi-Fi as well as built-in NFC for pairing to still pass through. So that's why the side here is also plastic. And if we look at the back plate here, it's also mainly plastic. However, the tripod thread is at least reinforced with metal, making it more resistant to wear and tear. And then on the very back, again, it's going to be plastic once again. So really just a bit of metal here on the front. That being said, I do like the overall design of this ZS50, and evidently Panasonic liked it as well because they're continuing to use the same one to this day. It straddles the boundaries of a clean, modern design, but also having some retro touches thanks to this two-tone color finish, which I do really like, that even brands like Fujifilm are incorporating into their camera designs as well. You also find a fixed xenon flash, so it's going to be quite bright compared to LED flash that's used on most phones. It's going to be more helpful in the dark and get you more of that authentic digicam look as well. In terms of the lens more specifically, even though it's branded by Leica, it starts at a f3.3 and then reduces down to f6.4 at the very end of that 30 times optical zoom range. So that starting aperture is pretty average for a digicam, to be honest, nothing exceptional compared to on the LX cameras. We've seen it come down to f2 and then going all the way down, in fact, to f1.4, I believe, on the LX7, which is just insane. So that faster lens, thanks to the aperture, basically allows more light to pass through quickly, enhancing the low light shooting experience and also adding more to the bokeh effect when coupled with a larger sensor size. So those are aspects that you definitely won't find here, but even so, the fact that a true 30 times optical zoom lens can collapse down to something as thin as this is, I mean, we essentially went from 10 times to 30 times in a same dimension body in just a couple of years apart, is already quite impressive from an engineering perspective. Now the grip here also feels pretty comfortable. The use of plastics also mean that the camera isn't too heavy, so it remains easy enough to use even with one hand, with an additional grip section here on the rear as well. The camera can also turn on very quickly if you wanted to just view back some of your shots by pressing on the playback key as a quick shortcut command. On the top there are built-in stereo microphones, but unfortunately with the ZS50 there was no external mic input slot, so you had to rely on those built-in microphones, and although it was okay sounding, it does have a tendency to pick up a little bit more wind noise. General video quality actually is quite good. In fact, I would say above average for a digicam. Now there's also a control dial here for swapping between options like intelligent auto, as well as program, aperture, shutter priority, in addition to the full manual mode, as well as 2 custom modes, similar to the LX3, which allows you to assign preset values for things like EV, white balance, as well as even some scene effects, and then more quickly adjust into your presets here on the fly, in addition to a dedicated scene selection mode. We have the 2-stage camera shutter key, half press to focus, and then all the way down to snap to shot for zoom, as well as for recording video. And then on the back here, you also had a conventional 4-way navigation toggle that can also be spun if you preferred this method, kind of like a click wheel on an iPod. Although since all the keys here are built out of plastic, I find that it has a little bit more of a looser tolerance than I would have liked to see. Sometimes they squish together a little bit more. So honestly, for higher precision, I just use it like a D-pad. Bottom here, you'll also find access to the battery compartment as well as the SD card reader slot. And yes, starting from the 2010s, the TZ series were mostly made in China, compared to, again, on the really early revisions of this line, they were actually still made in Japan, just as a quick FYI. Although, I guess one slight improvement here is the kind of early TZ series had the tripod thread on the side, making it a little bit more awkward, not quite as centered in terms of the weight distribution, and also for some reason, even though the body of the camera was metal at the time, the tripod thread was plastic, which was a little questionable compared to the other way around on the newer models. Anyways, turning on the system, I would say operation speeds are decent. Of course, it's not going to be lightning fast. If you're going between 1 times versus 30 times, which extends out to this pretty ridiculous profile view using these 3 sections, of course, it is going to take a couple of seconds to go all the way back down again to 1 times. But overall, it still feels like a comfortable enough shooting experience in most cases. The camera turns on at least relatively quickly. And again, if we are kind of zooming in, you can see that anywhere across the entire zoom range, images will remain nice and sharp, as well as offering, again, very fast autofocus capabilities. Also built-in optical image stabilization keeps things relatively still, although if you are going up to 30 times magnification, you still have to hold a little bit more still, since those micro jutters will get magnified the further in that you're zooming. Resolution of the camera is capped at 12 megapixels, but I think that's actually plenty, especially on a smaller sensor like this, so it doesn't get overcrowded. So in this example, let's also try taking a quick look at the optional companion app using that Wi-Fi mode. It is a separate button on the back of the camera. If you tap on this, it will turn on the camera's Wi-Fi, and then you just have to download the imaging app, available with both Android as well as iOS devices. From here, just tap on OK once you are connected again to the camera, and you'll be able to access the remote control mode. Functionally speaking, it's similar to an action camera or security camera. You can view back some of the photos that you're taking, as well as control properties like geotagging. There is built-in GPS on here as well, acting as a remote control, perhaps for time-lapse, or also if you want to take a selfie with a group of friends, setting it further away on a tripod. That is pretty cool. You don't have to purchase a separate remote now, and also being able to, again, transfer the images on your phone more easily and see the camera's battery life remaining here as well. So if we in fact tap the image there that we just took, you can see it just then loads up in a couple of seconds, making the file transfer process actually more seamless without any cables involved. And if we go into the recording mode, you can see the lens of the camera then also retracts. The screen, by the way, is turned off to consume less power, and there might be just a split-second latency, again similar to an action or security camera, but honestly it's not bad as long as you're a couple of meters away from the camera. From here, you're also able to access the same controls digitally now, including the optical zoom. So if we try and, again, continue pressing there, the zoom range will continue to increase, actually quite cool. and vice versa. And then the range here in blue indicates that we've gone into a digital zoom magnification. So with that hybrid zoom, it goes all the way up to 60 times, which is crazy. So again, 30 times is using the optical zoom where things will be sharp. Past this point, it will lose a little bit of detail, but you can get even closer to really far away shots. Maybe if you're in a stadium or capturing astrophotography, then that can be something to play around with. Additional quick settings here allow you to change white balance, ISO properties, exposure settings, as well as you can record video here as well. And then tapping on the Q menu here is where you can change properties like flash as well as the resolution. So it retains the majority of quick access controls that you would find on the camera as well that can be visualized on the app, actually working pretty well. Now, maybe the only downside is if you accidentally press on the Wi-Fi key, it does take around 3 to 5 seconds before you're able to kind of exit out of this mode, since the Wi-Fi chip is being activated and then you have to turn it off again. It's not as instantaneous as something like a playback key, which is going to be more seamless if you accidentally press it. But to Panasonic's credit, they've tucked this button kind of underneath the grip, making it a little harder to accidentally trigger, which I think is a good thing. In terms of some of the other settings we're able to control on the camera, we can tap on the display mode to hide everything from view, pull up more information, including that leveling tool that tells you if you're centered or not. And if we tap on the function key here, you can also pull up additional composition options, including grid lines. Compared to pressing on the center key, we're able to go into more advanced settings between Intelligent Auto Plus versus Intelligent Auto. So the Intelligent Auto Plus will also activate functions like HDR automatically if it's detected a difficult lighting condition with high contrast maybe in the background. It will snap a series of images and then process it using some computational techniques similar to on a smartphone, in fact, versus Intelligent Auto is mainly just detecting different types of scenes, changing some of the quick exposure settings and maybe color temperature, so not quite as exhaustive in terms of the processing work. But again, it still feels like a very modern camera with the HDR plus functionality, essentially working in the same way as most modern phones. Now, similarly, when it comes to recording functions, we're able to change things like resolution, as well as night shot, plus the flash settings that we talked about earlier. Now, going into some of the other modes, starting here, I think with the scene, this is actually quite fun. So you're able to manually toggle into some options like portrait, as well as soft skin, basically a beauty mode versus a night mode that will slightly increase the exposure time, but you have to hold more steady. And you can also find a sunset mode, adding a slightly more reddish orange tint to the images. Even a baby mode as well as pet mode is also found here as well, changing some of the skin and color tones, as well as a manual HDR mode, starry sky, looking through a glass window, and there's even a 3D photo mode, just by stitching a couple of images together. However, it doesn't actually have, again, 2 camera lenses. Now, if we go into this kind of paintbrush or artistic mode, creative control, this is where you're able to find some film simulation as well as filters, which are pretty cool, including dynamic monochrome mode. Now, note that this is a little bit different compared to the film grain mode that we saw on the LX3, which also adds a little bit of digital noise that's trying to simulate the film grain texture. On here, it's still a little bit more smoothened out. It's just a black and white image, but still very contrasty and nice to find it at a click. Other filters can also be found, including boosting up the contrast. There's also a toy effect that adds some vignetting on the outside versus having only one spot of color being activated in the photo, getting some more creative shots without requiring as much post-editing work to be done. Similar to on Fuji's film recipes, again, this might be a little bit more fun to just interact with. You can also activate a kind of stepped zoom control if you want to get into specific fixed focal lengths that are equivalents of traditional film cameras, including, again, 160, 200, 250, versus a stepless zoom function if you want more of that continuous range to play with. A live histogram view can also be pulled up here as well, and in here it's going to be capturing the images in RAW for you to edit later on, but it does take a couple of seconds longer sometimes to process, as you can tell, if you are capturing in RAW as well as with HDR turned on. I would say that overall operation speed shouldn't be that problematic compared to really early digicams. At least the autofocus itself is quite fast. By the way, here's also a quick example of the accelerometer trying to straighten out the video footage. After a split second, you can see that the image here gets straightened out. So that's actually pretty cool compared to on most camcorders and older cameras. You have to manually make sure that your shots are level, whereas on here, it's kind of doing that work for you using the built-in accelerometer. Further down below here, you can change the display's refresh rate from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. Furthermore, the screen can also be adjusted in terms of brightness as well as the color temperature. Pretty nice and vivid, plenty sharp with generous viewing angles as well, and you're able to get a pretty accurate view of some of your shots. One other advantage of a smaller sensor is it does have pretty solid macro capabilities as well. You can get just a couple of centimeters away from flowers and plants, and things still remain relatively sharp and in focus, as well as apply some auto retouching functionality or creative retouching as editing controls built into the camera. For example, you can also apply in post all of the different scene effects and filters that we saw there from earlier, which is pretty neat. Plus, the auto retouch is similar to what we see in Google Photos. It'll then apply some computational processing to improve things like the brightness exposure by itself, although the effect is still a bit more natural or neutral, I would say, compared to perhaps Google Photos, where it tends to crank the contrast and saturation up even higher. But still, it's neat to see some of these features available on a more modern camera like this. And now moving into some quick demos of what the picture quality is like. As shown, it's definitely possible to still get some very satisfying looking images out of this thing. It is more than capable enough for the casual shooter, even though the main advantage is going to be that super impressive 30 times optical zoom range, magnifying details far away in a small camera that still fits pretty easily into a pocket when you are traveling or on the go. You can still get a little bit of bokeh if you are using the macro capabilities, getting super close to an object, then something in the foreground maybe falls off just a little bit more. But generally speaking, if you're capturing landscape shots, then the sense of depth as well as dynamic range, of course, will still be limited, even though the images are still relatively sharp and clean for a camera in its class. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited kind of throwback review of the Panasonic ZS50, aka Travel Zoom 70. Again, with the resurgence of these digicams, since it does have really nice handling, the ergonomics are quite comfortable to hold. Using these physical controls instead of relying on a touchscreen, for example, having an optical viewfinder and all these built-in kind of film simulation effects, which are quite fun, not to mention the tactility of a kind of manual zoom ring on the front here is also quite satisfying to use, plus the impressive 30 times optical zoom reach is still an aspect that most phones are unable to match. Definitely is a model that is still worth considering, I would say, as an alternative to some of the kind of newest revisions, including the, again, ZS99 that just came out. So as long as you understand the constraints, you aren't expecting the best photo quality in the world, mainly just constrained by that smaller sensor, then I think it still is a pretty solid camera even after all these years. When it comes to the general design, performance of the autofocus is very fast and speedy, as well as packing in plenty of modern features even to this day. And one last point I forgot to mention earlier is there is a door here on the right-hand side for connecting to external displays, HDMI, as well as having a charging port. And what's neat is that this camera allows for pass-through charging while operating for video recording and capturing images simultaneously. In other words, you can be plugged into something like a power bank and still use it if you want to record hours and hours of video footage. I just point that out because on many earlier generation digicams, you had to physically remove the battery and then pop it into a charger to top it up, instead of having pass-through charging support built into the camera. So it actually is a little bit more versatile here as well. So if interested in something like this, you can check out more details in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been our throwback look at the Panasonic Lumix ZS50, aka Travel Zoom 70.